All right. Well, I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be with you all post-lunch and to have a conversation about something that feels actually quite critical in this moment in time. We're here together to talk about resilience, and of course, the thread that runs through many of our public conversations at the moment are the potential incredible opportunities of new technologies, and of course, the corresponding potential risks, the vulnerabilities, the harms that we need to be thinking about so that we can address them. In today's exceptional panel, we have a set of experts that come from a broad set of domains to help us consider some of these fundamental questions. How do we make sure that we're using these technologies in ways that lead to better human outcomes, that advance dignity and justice, that lead to more efficient responses to some of the most critical challenges that those around us might face? My name is Vilas Dar. I'm the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. We're a relatively young philanthropy. We consider ourselves really a 21st century expression of what it even means to be a foundation. And we center our work in really thinking about the social and human-centered impacts of emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, data science, and more. Our work starts from a pretty fundamental conception I think will resonate for everybody in the room here today. The technology standing alone offers an incredible promise, but without a deep understanding of who creates it, of how it's deployed, how it impacts communities, and how it leads to meaningful transformations in our social experience, we've missed the point. So in today's conversation, we'll focus a little bit on that piece of it. How do we ensure that we're centering communities, that we're empowering individuals, and we're using technologies to create the very best possible futures and outcomes? As I mentioned, I'm delighted to be here with an incredible panel, and I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly, to share a little bit about your organization. We're tight on time today, but we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. So, Prachi, maybe I'll start with you to kick us off, maybe with a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into some conversation.
Sounds great, and let's keep the energy going, even though this is post-lunch, right?
There you go.
So, hey everyone, happy to be here. First, I have to say that it's great to be on this panel because the topic of technology is always top of my mind, but what's closer to my heart is its intersection with the mission, with the human experience. So I'm Prachi Sukhtankar. I am a leader within Booz Allen's Civil Climate and Infrastructure business unit within the civil sector. And just as a quick background, I have been a technologist pretty much all my career, but having worked within federal and commercial, customer missions, it's really been a really interesting experience as to how I could pull that thread around the different domains where I have experience, whether that's environment, supply chain, energy, built infrastructure, and how does that all align under sort of this larger, climate mission umbrella. So real quick, bulk of our thinking and the focus of some of our work has been more around more strategic, long-term, proactive approaches to building resilience. And if I apply that lens, a variety of advanced technologies start becoming highly relevant and highly applicable, whether that's application of sensor data and integration to data analytics and AI and machine learning to some advanced technologies like digital twin. And I mean, the list goes on, enabling technologies like edge computing. So happy to talk about any and all of that and looking forward to the dialogue today.
Thank you. Please, Frank.
Awesome. Thanks, Vilas. Hi, everybody. Glad to catch everybody after lunch here. And again, we'll keep it high energy. Frank Schultz, I'm the founder and CEO of Infinite Blue. I've spent the last 20 years of my career working with organizations, some of the Fortune 10 down to a couple hundred-person companies, really focusing on business continuity, disaster recovery, incident management, mass communications, which all combines into what we call enterprise resilience. And clearly resilience is the buzzword of today, which is awesome. It's interesting to me that we spent a lot of time trying to define what resilience is. And so we've thought a lot about that at Infinite Blue. And really, what that means to an organization. And, it has some key components that I hope to talk about on the panel today, but it's really an organization's ability, from what we've seen working with hundreds of organizations globally, can you dynamically respond to something? Can you anticipate what could impact your organization? Can you respond in a coordinated effort? And can you evolve on the other side of that? And so can you be better in the end? I've heard the bounce back better earlier. Really love the conversation that there's no resilience without data. that someone said earlier, I would tag on, there's no resilience without data, without action as a response of that data. And that's what we do. We empower companies through our software and our advisory to understand the impacts and to respond and hopefully mitigate them and learn from what they've experienced.
Thank you, Frank. David.
Good afternoon. I'm extremely happy to be here. My name is David Fortino. I am the Director of Strategic Response for a company called Circle. We are known for our stablecoin USDC, and I know we're going to go into further detail about that later in the conversation. My background is quite unique. I actually started as a local first responder, so responding to sort of motor vehicle accidents, medical emergencies, et cetera, as a firefighter and EMS chief of an organization. I then progressed into working for FEMA for a little over 10 years in Region 2, the New York City office. And then I progressed further into the private sector, building a global crisis management program for an aerospace company, and then moving over to the fintech space. So you could see I definitely evolved my career as time has gone on, and it really provided me a unique perspective as to what resiliency looks like from either a financial institution to an aerospace company to the public sector. So I'm super excited today to talk about what resiliency means to Circle and how Circle could provide disaster survivors around the world fast, transparent, digital dollar during times of need.
Great, thank you. Sean.
Thanks. I'm Sean Griffin. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Disaster Tech. And my background, I'm a practitioner. I've worked with many of you here in the room. One of the keystones during my career and tenure in government was during the White House National Security Council. For many that know, work with me, I focused majority of my career on running exercises and scenarios. And so I was asked to come on the White House staff to support the transition, regardless of who was going to be elected president, going from the Obama administration, eventually, as we know, into the Trump administration. And what we learned from that experience is that, for example, when the administration changes, all that institutional knowledge over the last 8 or 4 years leaves with that administration. And so there's a complete knowledge drain. So one of the things that's interesting about AI, how can you use AI as a better memory bank to transfer knowledge, right, from institution to institution when we're changing the guard in our form of democracy? And then something else that from going through experience, particularly in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, Hurricane Maria and Irma, and leading the federal government's effort for power restoration after those storms, it was the lack of prediction. Right, the lack of prediction and insight of impact to the grid, to critical infrastructure, the things that rely on those systems, and how can we get better at predicting insight? So I think the promise of what we're going to talk about today of AI, its usage, one is the utility of AI in learning and understanding from the past, but also using AI to predict impact for the future.
Sean, perfect. So let's dig right into that. For decades or more, those of us who have been computer scientists and technologists have been calling for better data, for better understanding. But it feels like we've hit a bit of a sea change over the last few years, where we have now real momentum around data capture, around analysis, around understanding that predictive analytics can play a real role. What are you seeing? What are we learning in these early implementations? Where is AI really beginning to intersect with some of this disaster prediction relief engagement work?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first of all, our company is applying, I mentioned the Puerto Rico situation. We're utilizing AI to train models to better understand prediction of risk to the power grid and predict outages. That is heavily data intensive, and it takes heavy compute to run those models and to continuously update and refresh them. So it's very data dependent. But also what we're learning is that we can make unique inferences. So for example, where we don't have data from a power company, let's say overhead lines and distribution systems, we can use streets or other adjacent inferences to be able to make an educated guess. And that's where AI can fill in the gaps. Something else we're doing, in fact, we presented this at the Chamber of Commerce last year, or 2 years ago, excuse me, on using AI and transformer-based AI for finding misinformation and disinformation on the internet. What we're seeing now is that with the transformation in AI systems, particularly with the release of GPT-4, what used to be a spell check exercise using transformer-based AI, now it can think, it can reason, it can give you informed language-based responses on trying to help you understand your environment. So rather than having to farm out your problem to, say, a data scientist or to a bunch of engineers, a practitioner, an emergency manager, a firefighter can ask a natural language question of a database and get natural language back. So you're able to utilize these technologies for the first time really ever, and it's quite amazing the advances that have made just in the springtime of this year.
Incredible. So I think there's two things here I want to pick up on. One is you've given us a few of these use cases, right? Power grid management and analysis to say where there are going to be critical risks, right? We're going to talk a little bit about financial systems and other pieces. One of the themes that continues to come up for me is a lot of this work doesn't happen purely in a disaster response or prediction silo. Getting better granular understanding of power grids, particularly in vulnerable places, lets us not just manage in times of crisis, but also ask questions like, where does fundamental infrastructure investment lead to leveraged returns, right? These new AI predictive systems are equipping an entirely new set of resilience frameworks that aren't just what do you do in the critical 100 days after a disaster event, but really how do we begin to plan for the next decade? Has that been reflected in your experience? Like where are you seeing these kinds of longer term planning also coming up?
Yep, absolutely. So climate and climate change, of course, is the big one there. So being able to use long lead climate predictions to make better investment decisions. So certainly I don't want to make a large capital investment where that place on the earth is going to flood repeatedly. So I want to make different investment decisions on where I engineer or build a system. And we can use AI to learn from the past, but also using predictive data for the future over the horizon to make better investment decisions.
Amazing. Prati, let's come to you. I know this is a topic of real passion and interest for you and for Booz Allen. Tell us a little bit about kind of where we're seeing specific interventions on climate using AI tools and how that's leading to a more resilient culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to demystify this a little bit, right? Not that we are going to go deeper because we'll run out of time for sure, but the question to ask a little bit is, are the technologies themselves emerging, or is it really the application of those evolving, right? And the premise here is that the technologies have been fairly mature, whether we are talking about, I mean, you just have to open the smartphone and look at, how pervasive AI is there, right? So keeping that in mind, just being on that applied side and looking at the application to specific resiliency missions, there are a variety of things. Just to pull a little bit thread on, Sean, what you were saying, the climate risk analysis and the predictive analytics, that's a huge area, and happy to give a couple examples there. But even the natural language processing, and maybe we can move on from the ChatGPT conversation and even, talk about the broader field of natural language processing. If you think about the amount of knowledge that's untapped and buried within our text, whether that's, let's say, resiliency plans or folks using social media and web, during disaster, after, to collect the human experience, right? There is an argument to be made that we have not really scratched the surface of the possibilities there. Even something as simple as language translation, when we think of really catering to vulnerable communities and folks with different language experience. And another field that's fairly getting mainstream is just purely around understanding the natural and built environment through imagery and computer vision applications, where we are not only able to look at, from a point of view of damage assessment, but even saying, how do we prepare and plan for that? So there is a preparedness angle there, right? And just real quick, 2 examples. At Booz Allen, we support a large contract for the Army Corps of Engineers. And if you think about their mission, obviously it's largely around designing, developing, and maintaining critical infrastructure. So there are a variety of climate risk indicators across different threat vectors, whether that's the floods, heat waves. There's a whole big data platform underneath that, where data from USGS, NOAA, the climate models, CMIP 5, 6, all of that is ingested. Now you have the climate risk assessments to really assess installation level resiliency. And if you sort of swap that context and instead of installations, think about localities and other infrastructure, the core construct is actually very similar, right? So contextually, we can start cross-applying some of that. So that's one example. And another quick one is where we've been working quite a bit with digital twin, where think of digital twin as a digital replica of physical something. Could be an infrastructure, could be airport, could be a locality. So we've done some work with the Air Force, where it's a twin of a military base. And the idea is to really use that ahead of time before the reconstruction effort starts, and this was again after the hurricane hit and there was billions of dollars of damage, to say what is that future resilient infrastructure should and could look like. So now there is a lot of cost effectiveness built in there because you are figuring that out digitally and doing all of that scenario planning ahead of time. And again, it doesn't have to be a base. It could be any locality. For example, we are experimenting with taking EPA's air quality data, the same one that we get, right? Our smartphones get the alerts off of that data. And doing a pollution heat map. And the scenario here is, how does that change with the introduction of electric vehicles? Now, again, it doesn't have to be the same air quality sensors. It could be smoke sensors that detect fire and other things. So I think the applications are vast. Ultimately, what matters is how are we meaningfully applying those technologies and really even figuring out those last several miles where we provide that intuitive experience to the stakeholders.
Great. I think this conversation, and we're going to go a little deeper on use cases, but you spoke to two, right? Digital twins that allow us to have both a predictive capacity, but a planning and scenario forecasting capacity, which seems so core. A separate part of this conversation, but linked, is this hypothesis that I think we all share that, especially in a post-disaster setting, we want to move power quickly to communities to have agency to act as they need to. And a big part of that is access to financial networks. David, I know that you and your company have done a lot of work on this. Tell us a little bit about how emerging technologies are reshaping that fundamental question of financial agency in a time of crisis.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question. Moving money around the world is difficult, and it can be time-consuming, and it can be costly. So Circle's in a unique position to utilize blockchain technology and move money across the world in times of need. And we do that through a digital dollar, a stable coin called USDC. So let me give you an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Circle partnered with a nonprofit called UNHCR, United Nations.
I commission on refugees.
Yeah,
it's a tough one. It's too many non-vowels. Please keep going.
Refugees Committee, and they were an important partner with us to be able to assess the refugees in Ukraine who were affected by the war, and provide them with funds through a digital wallet. And so what is a digital wallet? What does that process look like? A refugee would go through UNHCR and determine whether or not they're eligible. Circle will partner with UNHCR, mint USDC. Those funds will go to UNHCR. The applicant receives an SMS message on their phone, and they download a digital dollar. USDC is then transferred to the applicant on their digital wallet, on their smartphone. And you could say, great, but then how do they actually get local cash? We then partnered with MoneyGram, and they could physically go to a MoneyGram location, and there's thousands around the world, and cash out in local currency through the digital dollar, through the digital wallet, and be able to have those funds in their hand. And you might say, well, that's great, but is it more transparent? What's the cost? It's more transparent. It could happen within minutes, whereas we don't deal with this sort of brick and mortar holidays, weekends off. Those funds could be transferred in minutes. And if that refugee wants to leave Ukraine and go to Poland, for example, they could also use those same funds and cash out at the MoneyGram location in Poland and also receive that local currency. So it's a way of really being able to get those funds directly from a stable USDC dollar, backed by the United States government, backed by the funds that support the United States and the transparency that we have to be able to get those funds directly to those refugees. We also did a big project with Venezuela and providing aid to healthcare workers during the pandemic that they were not getting at the time from their government in Venezuela. So, it's being part of FEMA before coming to the private sector and seeing. I know you brought up earlier about Puerto Rico. Flying cash down to Puerto Rico after Maria was it's not transparent. It's hard to control who gets it first. The speed's clearly not there. So this is really a way of getting that aid to local countries around the world in a fast, transparent, stable environment.
So David, you brought us to a place, a lot of what we've talked about so far are predictive or emerging technologies that transform organizational response. You're really talking about something that is in people's hands at a moment of crisis and vulnerability. And I'd love to hear from you what you've learned about the fact that many of the environments that you might see this operating in, digital literacy is relatively low, right? Points of access to online technologies and the digital divide are super relevant. How do you see kind of in that moment immediately post-disaster the journey of educating and supporting literacy around what USDC is, around how this cash transfer aspect works for those communities?
Yeah, good question. So 1.7 billion people in the world don't have access to brick and mortar banking. Yet 2/3 of those people have access to a smartphone. So the way we've been doing banking around the world, especially during times of disaster, is just not working that great. So the way, when we partner with UNHCR, they provide that assessment of the refugee, the person who needs that aid. They provide that literacy to understand, what is a digital wallet, how is this going to work, and then the MoneyGram, being able to actually get that local currency, allows for that money to flow very in a transparent, safe, and secure way using the USDC dollar.
Fantastic. Well, let's take this then to the middle layer, Frank. So we've talked about kind of like these macro models that can predict. We've talked about what happens at the front line. In between is all of the organizations that have to do this work. And we know that digital transformation, that kind of scepter of a word, has been really, really hard to engage with across many different sectors for a long time. Your work directly addresses that. Tell us how we should think about digital transformation. How do we equip the many organizations represented in this room to be able to really step in and effectively become not just users, but architects of these technologies?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think there's a lot of concepts in risk and in business continuity and even AI as we're talking about it, that become so kind of jargony that it really distances people from understanding what it is. I've been in, from a vendor perspective, building and enabling business continuity and disaster recovery and really resilient systems for 20 years. And it's really interesting when someone new comes into that space and they say, well, it's business continuity, it's really complicated, it's enterprise risk, it's all these terms that I don't understand, and it doesn't make it accessible for people to participate. And so, we think a lot about how do we engage more people in the concept of resilience. So if we take business continuity, third-party risk, enterprise risk, mass communications, crisis communications, all of that, and connect that together. And we say, how do we take every employee in an organization and give them the ability to help the organization respond and bounce back better and have an understanding? And so, if I paraphrase our mission for our company, it's, we're primarily a software vendor, but our mission really is to put the right data in people's hands at the right time. And that's really complicated. There's a lot of data. Prashi talked about this, how much data is out there, and how much, in your organization you need to thread together. And so, we look at an organization and we say, well, what do we have today that we can thread in? Do we have HR data? Do we know where people are working? Do we know if they're working from home, where they're at? Do we know what locations you have from offices? Do we know what vendors you utilize, what key applications, what processes, and thread that all together so when something happens, you very quickly understand, number one, the primary impact. Okay, a building's been lost. We have a hurricane situation, a flood, a power outage. It's not just that building. It's how does that affect the rest of the organization? Or is it a vendor that you utilize and you want to know, well, how does that vendor now affect our organization? You're not alone when a vendor goes down and it's a key vendor. There are other organizations that also have the same problem. And so they're trying to figure out, what do I do now? Because, I'm not going to name anybody in case somebody's in the audience, but this key vendor is down. What do I do? And so, we look at, I think someone earlier had said, 80% of the data that we need for resilience is in publicly available sources. We're taking National Risk Index data from FEMA that was talked about earlier and putting it into our products so that, and this is an example of what we're doing, so when someone imports their locations of their company, we can automatically populate risks based on the 100-year history that FEMA has in a lot of cases. And so we look at some of the publicly available data, and it's what can you mitigate ahead of time, what should you be aware of? But as soon as something happens, we thread real-time threat intelligence in to show you an event occurred, here's who you have or what you have in the area, here's how it connects to the rest of your organization, and we're going to help mobilize a response very quickly. We're leveraging And I'm really careful about AI and machine learning, right? Because I think they're two different things, and we could have a whole hour conversation on the difference. We're building machine learning models based on publicly available data and based on understanding how people respond to an incident. So the easiest way that I can say is if you think of the hurricane cone that you've seen when NOAA forecasts where a hurricane's going, we're trying to build that cone for your business when there's an interruption. If I wait and I don't do anything and I go farther out, how long is it going to take before it really hits a disastrous point or before it really hits a key point of impact, and how do we react? That's what we think about building machine learning models. AI we're going to get to, but we have to build the right models so that we hopefully can understand X occurred, we're going to mobilize and do Y, and maybe it involves failing over systems, recalling people, sending messages out. But I'm also really careful. We spend time talking about the fact we don't want to build Skynet for all you Terminator fans that are out there. So the system can understand and respond to something, but there has to be some kind of a check and balance so we don't eliminate the humans because we're the problem.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, when you go into AI, we have to be careful.
Well, let me pick that up, because I think that's probably where we should take this conversation. I mean, we've spent a little bit of time here, really, I think, painting a picture of some of the incredible opportunities that are out there. We could give you a taxonomy of things even beyond what we've talked about that are being deployed right now. We work with the UN to deploy a cell phone data-driven monitoring system that tells us where we might find the most pockets of vulnerability immediately past disaster. And a lot of things that are attached to that. But I think none of us here are naive about the fact that these tools have incredible power and also directly address systems of power. There are risks. There are things that we need to be concerned with. So in our last few minutes, I'm just going to ask us to go down the line. I'd love to hear thoughts on both what those kind of risks are that are really prominent in your minds as you're addressing the problems you've discussed, and if you have a sense of where we go next from here, like what's the next step to address those risks and to move forward, and that'll take us through to the end of our time. Prachi, maybe I will start with you.
Yeah, sure.
Risks and then mitigation.
Really wanted to pull that thread further as you were talking about it, and we promise we'll keep this conversational. So I think, couple areas that come to mind. One is that, to your point, right? We have to think of technology as an enabler, and oftentimes, especially in the context of data-heavy projects or AI, machine learning, we start losing that focus sometimes, right? Especially the hardcore technologies. So that has to be at the heart of, just the overall mindset, bookending that with deep discovery with the stakeholders, bringing them, in that conversation up front. Then you have your core solution, and again, separating technology from the solution, right? Because a solution has specific mission outcomes that we could and should care for, and really using those as measurement to have that smaller, agile, build, validate, and iterate cycle, as opposed to building monolithic, blobs of solutions, right? So that's one area. And real quick, the other one is that more and more through impacts of climate change, as we are bringing some of the climate science and all of those models into our solutions, there is an inherent complexity there already. And on top of that now, we are overlaying some of the advanced technology complexity. And we have to have that mindset again up front to say, how do we introduce transparency? It's not enough to say that a model performs at certain accuracy. What does that really mean? And how can we infuse that in our daily operations so that the resilience planner out there, knows what to do with that information, knows what kind of questions to ask. So real quick, just to close it out, I don't see a world where, a pathway to breakthrough technologies just doesn't exist. I think they are here and now. So what we need to do is think through how can we infuse them better in our operations, how can we integrate them, and don't lose the sight of that science and technology interplay. So I'll pause there.
Fantastic, great insights. Thank you, Prachi. Frank, about a minute.
Yeah, I think, look, I have a Tesla, and I laugh because I think of the technology in it, right? And it saved me from rear-ending people in a positive way, unfortunately, or fortunately. Self-driving, not quite there yet. Scares me and everyone else that's in the car. And so I think about, kind of where we're at today and where things are going. And we really, I think, have to be measured in how we implement and put checks in to make sure that we're getting the right results. So if you look at, ChatGPT is the most fundamental way that you can interact with an AI today, and people have access to it. Someone used it, I think, to do like a legal brief, and basically it had really amazing cases it cited, and none of them were actually real, but the findings were absolutely amazing, right? So the judges are trying to look up what are these cases that this system cited, and they aren't real. It made them up. And that's just something we have to be aware of and just be conscious of, that there's learnings of what's going to happen as a result of it. But my perspective, when we talk about AI and we talk about machine learning, it should be transparent to you as a user of a system where it's enabled. So ChatGPT, you're hitting it head on, you're talking to an AI. When we talk about resilient systems, we're basically trying to assist you, much like the braking system in my car, where it's there to help you when you need it, and it's kind of invisible when you don't know. It's just there in case you need it. So when you input locations or you do activities to respond to something, we're watching and we're going to give you a little nudge in the right direction to say, hey, you might want to try this.
Thank you very much. David.
So you mentioned earlier the FEMA index and how your tool's using it for big sort of risk analysis, predictive analysis, and I think that's a huge benefit of AI, is be able to take the data and be able to predict my risks within my company. I think where the struggle also is, though, is outside the United States, it's much more difficult to get good data to conduct those predictive analysis. When I think back to like my mother, who will not use an Apple Watch because she doesn't want to know the information that that it's providing, is what it creates that anxiety for her. Deep fake, misinformation, polarization. Information's great, but as we're talking about feeding that data, what is that data doing, and is it causing more concern from a polarization or misinformation perspective? If it's not being fed the right data. So I feel like, what's the old saying? What you feed it, what it spits out. Just where's that data coming from, and is it valid? Is it truthful? Causes a concern of mine.
Don.
So I think one of the greatest risks that maybe is underappreciated is that these models are computationally intensive, which means they require a lot of electricity. And with the electrification of everything, the more reliant we go on these systems, the more demand for electricity is going to be needed. And so the grid is already strained under climate, heat stress, extreme cold, et cetera. I don't think we have fully have understanding or anticipating the load requirement that's going to come onto the grid on these grid systems in order to house these extremely heavily computational systems. If you've ever been to a data center, it's a heat sink. It's very warm. You could fry an egg. So we need to be cognizant of the future risks of what these systems may demand of us as a society, and we need to start planning for that.
So what we haven't heard is anything about robots taking over. We haven't heard anything about Skynet beyond a single point of reference. But I think it's worth it for us to bring this back together, right? I mean, two themes that I've heard consistently across this discussion, and thank you all. The first is, I think we've all heard a real sense of optimism about the fact that these technologies truly can be transformative, not just about how we think about response, but even resilience, the long-term planning. And considering that as pervasive as these technologies are soon to become, every organization represented in the room today has something to do in terms of building and architecting how these tools will be used. The flip side of that, which you've also heard quite clearly, is this doesn't happen without participation and intention from those of us who are supposed to sort of hold the line around human vulnerability, around community participation, around intentional design that builds great solutions. So I want to thank you all. I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel for some great insights. And I know we're all eager to continue the conversation. Thank you all. Very good. All right. Shall we?